Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Amita Bide from Tata Institute of Social Sciences, and this is a module on dealing with poverty and exclusion as part of the paper on community organization. One can analyze poverty, one can theorize poverty, but I think it is another thing altogether in order to envisage and to actually act on how to move out of poverty and exclusion. So this module basically engages with the strategies for moving out of poverty and exclusion. And therefore we will take an overview of different programs and initiatives in India that address poverty and exclusion. These kind of initiatives are basically divided into 4 major sections, and we will try to see all of these as we go ahead in this module. Before moving into these sections and these different aspects of attempts to move out of poverty, we will basically see that poverty has most visible forms, but it also has extremely invisible forms as well. So while hunger may be a most manifest form of poverty, we have seen that there are so many aspects that are intangible, that are behind that, both sometimes as an outcome but also as manifestations of poverty itself. And moving out of poverty and exclusion or dealing with poverty needs to recognize this entire continuum itself. So when we address strategies, we are going to understand both these kind of strategies. We don't just limit themselves to looking at income poverty and treating poverty line as basically a game, but something which is addressing itself to the question of a more sustained experience of actually confronting exclusion. We will also see and we will recognize that deprivation is not just linked to individuals. It is not just an experience of particular households, but that it also manifests itself in the experiences of groups. So both of these is something that we will try to see. Now, what are these 4 different realms? We are going to look at struggles of the poor themselves. We are going to look at more organized social movements. We are going to look at policy action, state action, and we will look at also civil society action. Now, in terms of struggles of the poor, I think one of the basic principles that needs to be asserted here is that poor are not just victims. Firstly, they are the primary agents in the redressal of poverty and exclusion, and they are constantly engaged both silently as well as actively in resisting deprivation and countering deprivation, but also trying to reconstruct their lives in order to sometimes survive, to cope with poverty, as well as to improve their situations. And we need to recognize these kind of struggles which the poor are waging at their own level itself, and that then becomes the basis for recognizing what are the strengths of these attempts, what are the capabilities which are involved in them, and how does one strengthen those kind of efforts. Now, to these kind of efforts, there are 2 dimensions. One is a everyday or a daily aspect, and the second is a more strategic kind of a dimension. So sometimes you will basically see that most aspirations of the poor, as Arjun Appadurai points out, are very, very specific. They are pragmatic, they are material, they are in the form of particular goods and outcomes, they are very proximate. Okay? Now, aspirationally or strategically, these kind of aspirations really have to be developed, nurtured, in order to develop into a navigational tool, which then enables a politics of voice and a politics of presence. And I think this is a very, very important point that basically we need to recognize, because there may be point to saying to not stay hungry, what is it that the poor engage in? To take action vis-a-vis the ill health of a child, what are the actions that a poor household will undertake? Or in order to resist a development which they see as against their interest, what are the set of actions or non-actions that a poor household will undertake? But as against this, to translate this into a strategic tool, this proximacy of outcomes, the proximacy of aspirations needs to be translated into a larger politics, and that really requires a strengthening, nurturing. But that cannot happen unless we recognize this agency which is vested among individuals and households first. Only that can form the foundation of a design which can lead into this navigational tool. So when we move into this thing, I want to take you into another kind of a realm, and this is basically in terms of how struggles of the poor are, and when they are linked to civil society efforts, and what are the frequent traps that they encounter or that are seen. Robert Chambers, who has spent long years in India, talks about 7 different types of traps. And these are very interesting traps, I think, which one again needs to recognize in terms of these struggles of the poor. So one is a spatial trap. And this spatial trap is that most development practitioners have a bias towards focusing on those villages, those localities which are close to the road or a means of transport which is convenient to outsiders. So the most interior places, the most remote places, or even in urban areas, those poor areas which are most distant from infrastructure actually tend to be left out instead of becoming the focus of attention. Similarly, one sees that there is a project bias, and this project bias basically means that development projects try to focus on creating one spectacle of development where everything kind of converges and produces a best practice, a best result, while the spread out of this resources to other areas is really neglected. So this is something which is very clearly an outcome of a project focus and that kind of a trap. A third trap is really linked to person. One tends to privilege those voices which are strong, which tend to talk in the same terms which developmental agencies also want. On the other hand, those voices which are weak are actually neglected. Then there is the more familiar trap of season, and that is that most difficult seasons like monsoons, like the height of summers, are actually avoided. You visit areas in times where things are more comfortable, relatively. And then that is actually also seen as a quick dip into understanding the scenario. So in understanding struggles of the poor, when we begin to locate ourselves in these traps, it creates a very biased understanding of poverty, exclusion, and how we respond to it as well. Then there is the more diplomatic trap. In a diplomatic trap, one basically wants to perhaps outreach to those people who can make the most noise, I would say. So one reaches out to influential persons, one reaches out to more important persons, whereas one doesn't reach out to the more needy persons. There is a professional bias, and this is little more dangerous, little more indirect as well, because what the professional bias does is that it gives importance to a disciplinary focus, speaking from theory rather than speaking from experience, giving importance to data rather than importance to the experience per se. And these are very, very important aspects of what a professional bias or a professional trap can actually do to the overall practice of development and being responsive to the struggles of poor. Finally, there is also a security trap, and this security trap is linked to how you give priority to physical and other forms of security of outsiders. And this is done in terms of making several decisions, and as a result, it is the more safer areas, safer especially to outsiders, which actually get given priority in terms of the overall development programming per se. So when we see the entire aspect of individual struggles, individual agency, and how development struggles build, one can see there is already a disconnect which has begun to happen of how development practitioners of different kinds, whether it is government actors, whether it is non-government actors, actually respond to issues of development that the poor face and issues of poverty and exclusion. So now let's begin to look at a third realm, and this third realm is in terms of looking at policy action. Now in policy action, there are different kinds of possibilities which are there and which have been experimented with. So firstly, there has been asset-based intervention. What does asset-based intervention mean? Basically, it means creating access to productive assets for the poor, giving land or giving loans, giving housing, and all of these can be important, but often what tends to happen is these assets tend to be seen individually, sectorally, and there is no holistic focus. So when you give housing, often you will see housing bereft of perhaps livelihood. Or when you give land, you see land bereft of infrastructure. And these are often things that tend to happen. So one needs to understand that asset-based interventions are important, in fact very, very critical, but one needs to also have a little more holistic approach to these and also create systems by which people can sustain those assets. That is an equally important thing to keep in mind. There are skill-based actions. What skill-based actions try to do is to impart vocational or entrepreneurial skills so that people can have a better position in the labor exchange. Here too, I think the intent is very good. It can really prove very critical, but again the systemic relations of the skill, and because labor exchange also involves a valuation on the basis of self-esteem in some ways, it matters a whole lot, and one also sees that other aspects of human capital are also a critical aspect of these skill-based programs. For example, in Gujarat, there are several organizations which trained women masons, but in spite of having qualifications and skills in masonry, women masons are still paid lesser than male masons in the labor exchange, because that particular dimension of their ability to contribute in the market is actually not recognized at all. Policy actions have sometimes also been mass employment based, and so what does mass employment do? Basically, it engages, creates public works so that so that distress at times of crisis is really alleviated. One classic example of this is Manrega, which in many instances in non-agricultural months can work to or actually keep the wage rates intact at a particular level. But on the other hand, one could see that these mass-based employment works are very difficult to imagine. So if they are accompanied by a creative imagination, then they can have an extremely important impact. Another dimension has been infrastructural support, and in infrastructural support, basically it is enabling poor entrepreneurs by actually mainstreaming, by providing them new markets and by providing them new production spaces as well. Similarly, there are non-material capability investments. For example, the entire aspect of empowerment, and there have been significant experimentations in India about these kind of investments also. So for example, programs in Rajasthan, in Uttar Pradesh, in Karnataka around the empowerment of women and building their collective institutions has been something which have played a very, very important role. We look at a different realm of and proposition for policy action, and which is a proposition which comes from the livelihoods framework. Susan Lovehead, who first classifies the poor into 3 different categories, and then they also prescribe different dimensions of policy action as well. So according to this framework, one basically divides and classifies the poor into 3 categories, which are poor which are declining. Declining basically means that the overall capability status is one in terms of the interfaces of all different capitals and assets, etc., is one which is not only not able to sustain, but there are so many shocks that the poor household is undergoing that they are constantly in a declining mood. And this is the case with several groups that one can see, especially if one looks at tribal groups in Melghat, which are now also reducing in their overall lifespan status. Their numbers are reducing, and that's like the ultimate in some ways outcome that one can see. There are coping poor. So coping poor are those who are not on the downhill path. They are just able to make ends in some ways meet. So there are shocks from time to time, but they also seem to have the means in order to cope with these crises. Improving poor are those which have now in a position that they have sufficient wherewithal in order to move forward and to entertain certain possibilities of improvement in their actual either in economic status but also in their overall opportunity status as well. Now, understanding these 3 and defining these 3 may be a very complex task, but I think if one is able to do this and look at poor in terms of these dynamic kind of categories, then it is also possible to fix what kind of interventions are necessary for the coping poor, what kind of interventions are necessary for the improving poor, and what kind of interventions are necessary for the declining poor. Just to give an illustration of this incrementalism of strategies, just in terms of quality of security strategies, let's say. For the declining poor, what is very important is to actually have some income stream. They would also require tenure rights, they would require basic education, skill training, saving schemes, community support systems. But when it comes to the coping poor, it is about maintaining a steady income stream. They would require more secure housing. Their concern would be about that rather than necessarily a tenure right. It would be about upgradation of that housing. It would be about upgrading skill opportunities, about education and legal support, which perhaps is completely absent from the overall imagination of security for the declining poor, whose imagination focuses on much more survival kind of needs, and savings and credit schemes. When it comes to the improving poor, besides income streams, one can also entertain possibilities of home ownership, not just upgradations and security of housing, but home ownership. One could also think of enterprise development and not just skill upgradation. Similarly, this is one category for whom loans for enterprises can actually be thought of. Similarly, what is very critical is legal support, because this is a group which can be enabled to actually move into a more included citizenship category. And I think when one is understanding interventions in this kind of a manner, which is a graded manner, it is there is a possibility to nuance interventions and then actually fix something which is appropriate to the kind of conditions in which households live. I'll move to some important issues in policy action for poverty and exclusion. One of the things which is very critical is targeting, and which has really emerged as one of the most debated issue in the entire realm of redressing poverty. In the recent years, there is a thinking that a generalized or a universalized poverty redressal mechanism or social safety mechanism is extremely costly, and therefore one needs to target. Okay, but targeting, while it can be thought of in conceptually, there are huge difficulties in operationalizing targeting, and therefore this can result in many more exclusions. Also, there are issues and failures both in terms of methodologies as well as the application of particular methods to identify the poorest of the poor or poor and so on and so forth. In this context, there are some approaches to targeting where, like Fockingham and Namazi, who advocate basically that one should use proxy indicators, more participatory methods in order to identify this targeting. But targeting does remain a very, very fuzzy kind of a issue where both definition and application remains difficult, but definitely it is one of the more favored kind of directions of policy in current times. In terms of looking at Fockingham and Namazi's proposals, there are some innovative methods which have been used in some governmental programs and projects. One very interesting example of using vulnerability indicators is the environmental health project in Indore. This environmental health project in Indore basically looked at collective dimensions of vulnerability among urban communities. And what they did was, at the city level, in a participatory manner, they identified indicators of which are those communities which are most neglected. This is not identifying name by name, but basically arriving at indicators for this. They came up with things like those communities which are most insecure, those communities which lack basic services like water, or the water availability is X. Okay. Those communities which lack toilets, those communities which lack electricity connection, those communities in which the presence of Dalits is greater than 50%. So these are the kinds of indicators which they came up at a city level. Then these indicators were applied to different communities, again in a participatory manner, and then communities in which policy action had to be prioritized were identified for action. Similarly, in the Kudumbashree program in Kerala, one has seen the application of economic parameters along with non-economic parameters of vulnerability. These include things like woman-headed households, thinking about households where there is a chronic disease, and so on and so forth. So these are really innovative approaches in targeting, which, as I said, remains favored but also fuzzy. Another issue to consider in policy action is what is the appropriate level of action. Should policy actions towards poverty and exclusion, should they be determined at a national level, at a state or a subnational level, or at a local level. Overall, there seems to be an agreement that the local level is the most appropriate for effective intervention. And therefore, in some ways, both the 73rd Amendment and the 74th Constitutional Amendment provide for poverty redressal as one of the functions of rural local governments and urban local governments. But what is very important here is who spearheads the implementation of these policies and programs. Whether it is government action, whether it is specialized human resources, whether it is residual workers who are considered fit for nothing and who are untrained, whether it is determined at the top and with only the small bits of implementation which are left at the local level, all of these become very important issues in determining the appropriate level of action. We move now to this final realm of looking at civil society efforts in redressing poverty and exclusion. So, one thing which should be recognized here is that civil society has perhaps spearheaded some of the most innovative efforts for countering poverty and exclusion, but also in a very diverse manner. It is not an even territory, it is very, very diverse. Okay. What are the lessons which are learned from some of these? One, that people who are poor need to be at the center of any effort. And when we say that they should be at the center of the effort, it basically means that their active agency, all these efforts need to be led by them, thought through their eyes, and also evaluated by them. That there has to be a power analysis to understand how poverty is being experienced and how it is being perpetuated. So when we keep people at the center, this does not mean just it's like a namesake, but basically that one engages with power analysis in a participatory manner in order to analyze this experience of poverty. The second important lesson which civil society efforts actually give us is that collective dimensions to address the structural causes of poverty are extremely important. That these kind of networks of solidarity led by the excluded themselves, their own voice, are very, very important in order to be effective. These struggles, these kind of networks helps them to improve their bargaining, both in relation to the other powerful sections, but it is also important in terms of improving their bargaining in relation to institutions of the state and the market itself. One also sees that it is necessary to build people's institutions for creating meaningful alternatives. And when we talk about institutions, these new alternate institutions, as opposed to some of the more traditional institutions which perpetuate poverty, are necessary as a backup and as an opportunity to move from these different stages that we saw, from survival to coping to improving to consolidating, and institutions help facilitate that. And finally, one needs to also look beyond single output models to create and think of more sustainable kind of impacts. For example, one may just be building a toilet. That may be a project, okay? And it is important as a poverty redressal effort. But even while building that toilet and undertaking that process of construction, one needs to look at primary factors, one needs to look at the overall process of how we build a toilet and who is involved, how it is involved, what is the design. One needs to look at post-construction process, and one needs to look at outputs as well. We've seen and located different efforts ranging from an individual level to looking at policy action to looking at civil society and collective movements. I think one needs to also understand from research, what are the prospects really of moving out of poverty? And research seems to be pretty, I wouldn't say very optimistic in this regard. Firstly, I think one should qualify this with saying that there are not too many longitudinal studies. There are not too many panel studies which carry out studies in multiple contexts. But at the same time, there are a few which show and talk about and give us some indications about what are these prospects about moving out of poverty. So we take from there some pointers for talking about this redressal of poverty. So Nolan and Erickson in 2007, they talk about if there are higher levels of poverty, then poverty escapes are also fewer, which means it is more difficult to emerge out of poverty in cases where the level of poverty is very, very high. We also see, and they also conclude, that there are short-term studies which always overstate the extent of movement of out of poverty. So if you look at policy action, the impacts of policies or the impacts of civil society programs as well, there is a tendency to, I wouldn't say glorify, but definitely overstate their impacts in terms of how much the movement out of poverty is sustainable, what is the extent of that movement, and so on. The third, I think, which is again a very important conclusion, is that there is a considerable geographical variation in the prospects of mobility. Overall mobility is also linked to the opportunities for mobility in the wider area per se, and we need to understand this in the backdrop that all over the world there is a trend towards more and more uneven development. And when we are talking of uneven development, then staying in geographical areas which present very few opportunities for mobility perhaps also curtail your overall mobility prospects. They also talk about stigma and exclusion as being actually even more difficult to counter, because stigma and exclusion accentuate the impacts of economic and other deprivation. And I think therefore perhaps one needs to become even more sensitive to groups which face systemic stigma and exclusion. Finally, what emerges from all of this is that for moving out of poverty and redressing poverty and exclusion, we really need interventions with a long-term perspective, with multi-sectoral approaches, and yet those which are highly localized and contextualized. This is a lesson which needs to be taken home both by policy as well as perhaps by civil society movement and action. In conclusion, perhaps one should say that poverty and exclusion are highly debilitating problems. They are produced through a combination of factors, many of which are structural. We acknowledge these, and therefore dealing with poverty and exclusion requires a creative practice. Minimally, it helps that you have to have a ongoing learning and outreach right to the last level. You have to have a practice which converts small opportunities also into more sustained efforts. It cannot be only a series of big efforts. We need to look at time and stretch it out over a longer temporal period. You need to have a practice which combines several elements, because you need to counter both substantive areas and of deprivation, but at the same time you need to also counter structural issues. And most critically, I think we need to be aware that this practice has to bring the excluded to the center of the development effort. We can look at again several critical references linked to this. We have Barbara Harris Smith, who takes an overview of different poverty alleviation efforts in the regime of capitalism. We can look at Deepa Narayan and Petish again, who talk about moving out of poverty. One could look at several interesting civil society reports which have been brought out, which talk about and document multiple lessons and cases and case studies of dealing with poverty and exclusion. And of course, some of these are mentioned in the text itself. So do look up the text. Thank you.